This year we walked a tightrope, from all the highest hopes to all just trying to cope. We had grand adventures planned, and the world said, nope.
What's up YouTube? This is going to be an editing breakdown video of the Yacht Week film that I just posted. Now, if you haven't seen part one, in part one I go into the Premiere project and I talk you through the timeline and the overall adjustments that I've made, and I talk you through a lot of the sound design that I've done. So if you're interested in that, check it out. There's a link on screen right now. This is part two, and we're going to spend the whole time in the After Effects project. The first shot we're going to look at is this one of Aggie on her laptop, where we see this digital calendar evaporate and disappear in a puff of smoke. And then the second one we're going to look at is Jacob on his phone, scrolling through social media and reminiscing about better days. Then we're going to take a look at some of these 360 sequences that I've done. I'm going to talk you through how I make the transitions and how I stitch these 360 shots together. And I'll also tell you about how I splice together the two different hemispheres of two separate 360 shots to create this unique transition. And then finally, I'll talk you through this photo flickbook effect, where I stitch together a burst of images from a camera to create this stop motion, funky Polaroid effect. Let's do this. So the first shot we're going to take a look at is this Aggie scrapbook shot, and this is the shot where we see her calendar floating on top of her laptop, and then, you know, all of her kind of hopes and dreams disappear and evaporate in front of her eyes. One thing that's quite interesting to note is that we use these really distorted anamorphic lenses, and if you look at this edge here, you can see how curved it is, and that's just as a result of the lens. You know, that should be a straight line. So I've actually used a plugin called Lens Distortion Matcher, and I've put that on top of the graphics, and what that does is it kind of bends the graphics to match up with the distortion of the lens. So if I turn that off, you can see the graphics end up looking sort of straight, but that doesn't really work with this lens. So this plugin kind of distorts the graphics so that they suit the background image. But if you're using a standard lens, it probably won't distort anywhere near as much as this, so you don't need to worry about this. Anyway, let's jump on into the composition. I'll show you how it was made. So the way that the lens distortion thing works is it actually kind of undistorts the background image, and that's why the corners look a bit funky and a bit distorted, because what it does is it sort of unpinches it here. You put your graphics on, everything's nice and straight, and then when you take it back out again into your kind of distorted frame, it adds the curvature back in again. So that is why the corners here look a bit weird. The other thing to note is this is the ungraded footage that we're working on here. But yeah, the final step in the process is I do all the grading in Resolve, and then I take the graded image and I bring it back again into here, and then I put the graphics on top of it. Anyway, but for preview purposes, we're just going to be looking at the ungraded footage. So the way that I attach the graphics into the scene is I used a pretty simple 2D motion tracker. So on this background layer here, open it up, you can see we've got this motion tracker. So what I did is I basically just tracked the top of this apple using the motion tracker here. Sometimes you have to clean it up and do it manually, but it creates quite a good track, and that's what we use to attach our graphics to the laptop. Once I've done the tracker, I would have created this solid here, which is just a layer, a shape layer. And then you go back down into your tracker here, select what you want to do, and then in the target section here, edit target, select track solid 1, hit OK, and then hit apply, X and Y, yes, 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 and it's just going to copy the tracking data onto that solid that you've created. And if we have a look at that solid, you can see that solid is now attached by the sort of track point there, in the place that you want it. This also needs to be a 3D layer, so you can hit this button here and turn it into a 3D layer. I would have just sort of played around with the rotation, just so it kind of feels like it's in the right place for where I want my graphics to be. If we go up into this calendar layer, this is where all the kind of stuff lives. I'm actually going to turn off this track solid, because that's just the thing that's positioning our graphics, but we don't want to see it, so turn it off. What I've done is I've just literally used this function here, which is the parent function, parented my calendar to this track solid here. So what this does is it basically sets this track solid as the kind of origin point for the calendar. So if I go into the rotation of the calendar here, you can see it's all 0, and that basically just means that it's going to lay completely flat on top of this track solid that I've created. So if I hit R on the track solid and I give it a bit more rotation, you can see that the graphics are also going to rotate. Basically anything I do to this track solid is going to affect the calendar graphic as well. And it's just a slightly neater way of laying out your composition. You could have applied the tracking data directly to the calendar, but I quite like to use a solid in between, because that means if I want to move the calendar around, I can hit P, I can do this, I can move it left and right, I can move it forward and backwards in 3D space. But if I was going to do that in the track solid, if I hit P, you can see all of my position keyframes are really important, because these are the position keyframes that have come from the motion tracker. So I don't want to move it around here, because that's going to mess up my motion tracker. Whereas if I want to move my calendar around, I can just adjust these parameters, but it's always going to be parented to the track solid. So any of the position movements that come in from this motion tracker here are still going to apply to the calendar. So I just think this is the best way to set up a scene like this. Anyway, let's jump into the calendar itself. So let's just play this through. This is basically just the kind of graphic design thing. There's actually nothing particularly complicated going on. I just used a bunch of different shape layers to create the days in the calendar. I've got these, these boxes here in different colors. And then I just animated the position and the scale to make them kind of animate on and off like this. The one thing that I think is quite interesting to talk about is the way that the words and the things kind of move up out of the plane. So let me just show you two views so you can see what I mean. So if you have a look at the top view here, you can see as we progress through and the animations start, you can see all these red layers here. These are the words, these are the text, these are the things saying like Hawaii, Galapagos, etc. They kind of come out of the plane, they're moving forward. And the way I've done that is if we just hit P on this, you can see the position keyframes. I've just keyframed the Z value here and I've just got it to move forward out of the plane. So you can see it moving forward there. And all the other layers do that as well. Obviously for this to work, they need to be 3D layers, so everything in this composition is a 3D layer. So I think the cool thing about this graphic is the way that the words come up out of the plane. And it's quite easy to create that in a pre-composition like this. But what's really, really important, if we just jump back into the main composition here, so we'll just play that through again. You can see the word leaving the page and evaporating forwards. And we've kind of retained this three-dimensionality to it. And this is this sort of 2.5D graphic style. And actually, if we just zoom in, you can also see there's sort of two layers of the calendar itself. I've got this kind of lighter background layer, which is just the same shapes kind of positioned a bit further back on the Z-axis. So you've got these 2D layers, but they're floating in three-dimensional space and they're kind of separate from each other. Obviously, in the pre-composition, you've got all the different layers positioned on top of each other. What's really important, the only thing you need to do to make this effect work is you're going to use this little sun icon here in your main composition. And what this does is it basically preserves 3D editability of all the layers inside this composition. So if I turn this off, you can see it kind of flattens everything. I'll turn it on and turn it off again. So everything gets squashed together. And now if I play this through, there's none of that nice 3D depth. All of these like bits of text are just completely flat. If we zoom in again, you don't get that kind of cool depth. It doesn't feel like it's occupying 3D space. So let me turn it back on again. So this is the trick to this 2.5D effect. It's basically just about creating the layers in a pre-composition and making sure you've got this little sun icon ticked so that when you bring them back into your main composition, you do your animations and you track them into the scene, they also retain this kind of three-dimensionality. And then the next effect that I've used is one that I use a lot. If you watch any of my other videos, you'll have seen me talk about this before, particularly the Bugsy Malone editing breakdown. This is called Trap Code Shine, and you can buy this plugin. I think it's about $79. I'll put a link in the description. And this creates these kind of cool light beams. So let me just turn off the background because we don't want it to affect the background. There we go. So it's created these kind of cool light beams coming out of the calendar. So I'll turn that off, turn it on again. So you can see that this shine effect is actually creating these kind of real looking light beams that are coming out of the bright areas of the image. So this is a really cool effect. If you want to learn more about this, then definitely watch my Bugsy Malone tutorial because I talk about Trap Code Shine a huge amount in that, and I used it on literally everything in that.
This year we walked a tightrope, from all the highest hopes to all just trying to cope.
So this is the graphic shot of Jacob on his phone. And I've actually got the same kind of lens distortion thing going on here, so that's why the corners are really bowed and weird. If I just jump back into the final composition, you can see that the plugin is kind of distorting my graphics to match up and look neat inside the scene. I'll just toggle that on and off again so you can see the difference. So those are the graphics that really don't match and don't suit the scene because they're not curved. But this plugin kind of distorts them and makes them look more natural. So let's just jump into one of these compositions here. So this is the social media timeline. Basically all I did for this is I just screenshotted his Instagram account and then I made this like kind of long vertical wall of it. And then if we come to the end here, I created this sort of loading icon. And then I've got this kind of glitch layer. This is like a sort of glitchy texture, alpha glitch, so we'll just play it for you. This is something I made a while ago and I use it in quite a lot of different things. And it's making these unloaded Instagram photos sort of glitch out. And the way that I did that is I used a displacement map, and that's what's on this adjustment layer here. So the displacement map takes an input layer. So in this case, we're using this alpha glitch texture that I just showed you. If I turn that off, you can see everything's normal. Turn it back on again, and it basically distorts everything underneath using the layer that you select as the input. You can change the parameters here to make the distortion less or more. So that's just a nice way of getting this kind of like cool glitch effect. So I created this kind of timeline, and this is just made up of a couple of shape layers here. So this is one of them, shape layer 3. So this layer is giving us these little kind of smaller teeth of the timeline, and then this layer here is the larger ones. So what I've done is I've got the original rectangle, then I've used a repeater just to repeat this like that. You can see it's all kind of getting repeated, and that was just like an easy way to duplicate the shape and make this kind of timeline. So it's just a rectangle and a repeater. Let's just jump into one of these little loading wheel icons as well. So I've just used an ellipse, and then again I've used a repeater, and then this time I've just added a bit of rotation. So you can see each one of these circles is offset by 30 degrees from the one before it, and that just means we get this even spread. If I change the angle like that, you can see they get closer together and they bunch up. And then the whole shape itself is just animated to rotate once every second or every 2 seconds or so. And that's about it for the design of the timeline. Now let's just jump out into the main composition and I'll show you how I made it scroll. And to make this work, I use something called alpha matte. So if you don't know what an alpha matte is, you're about to learn. Really, really useful technique. I use it all the time, and it just makes something like this really, really, really straightforward. So this layer here, shape layer 1, which is turned off, if I turn this on again, you can see it is 2 rectangles, basically just simple shapes, and they've also got the blur effect applied to them. And this layer is what I've used as an alpha matte. So underneath it, we've got Jacob feed, and that is the timeline thing that we've just built. If I go toggle switch modes, you can see that this column here, the track matte, is set to alpha inverted. And that basically takes the alpha channel, which is the transparency of the layer above it, and uses that to chop out the bit that we want. So I could turn that to alpha matte, and you can see actually, if I just turn the yellow off, that's going to leave us with the negative. That's going to leave us with what's underneath the boxes that we've drawn. And that's not what we want, so that's why we're using alpha inverted here. And that just means that I can keyframe the position of this timeline, which is what I've done to move it up and down, and create that scroll effect. And the bit that's underneath the alpha matte that we've drawn, the shape layer here, is the bit that we're going to see. It means it's really easy to keyframe the position and have it moving up and down and scrolling like this, but we don't have to worry about like keyframing any masks, and we're always going to see the kind of central portion. And the reason that I put the blur on the shape layer, if I turn the blur off, you can see you end up with these hard edges here. Just play that through. The scrolling effect doesn't look anywhere near as nice. It's much nicer to have the blur, so the timeline kind of slowly disappears off at the top and the bottom like this. The next thing that's super important to remember when you're doing anything like this is motion blur. So you want to toggle your switch modes back again, and you can see this button here, the motion blur icon. Make sure that motion blur is turned on for the composition as well. Anything that's got fast moving actions like this is always going to look so much better and so much more realistic if you've got motion blur on. You can see here right in the middle of the transition, the layer is really, really blurry. It looks really natural. It looks like there's a real thing floating there in front of his face, which would of course blur if it was moving that quickly. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about the tracking and how I've inserted the graphics into the scene a little bit later. But just like the shot with Aggie in it that we saw before, I've also used this kind of 2.5D graphic style. So if I turn this layer off, you can see there is another layer behind, and this is exactly the same thing. And to create this background, I just used the same layer, and I threw a fill effect on it just to fill it all grey. And then I turned the opacity down to 20%. And then I've positioned this just a little bit further back in 3D space. So if I turn the front layer on again, you can see you've just got the kind of edges of the outline back here. You've got the second layer, which is sitting just a little bit behind. I like to do that because I think it just adds a bit more three-dimensionality, a bit more depth to it, and it makes everything just look a little bit more interesting. So that's how we created the scrolling timeline. Now, the next thing I'm going to talk about is this date graphic here that goes from 2019 to 2020. So let me just jump in on that composition. You can see all I've done is kind of fairly straightforward text animation. I'm not going to go into too much detail, but the way that I do this is I use the animate text properties here. And you've got, if you tick enable per character 3D, you can move individual characters around in 3D space. And then you can use the range selector and various other properties to animate text like this. There's plenty of tutorials out there on text animation. Maybe I'll do one, but I don't want to go into too much detail now because you've probably got a reasonable understanding of how to do something like this. Now, to create the graphic style of this, there's 2 layers of every bit. So there's a background layer here, which is this layer here. And if I go T, you can see the opacity of this background layer is 25. And then you've got this foreground layer, which is just an outline. And the opacity of this is 100%. So if we jump back into the main comp, you can see the background is quite see-through, but you get these kind of nice, solid foreground lines. And again, the background layer is just a little bit further back in Z space. It's maybe 20 pixels behind the foreground layer, and that just adds that extra three-dimensionality. Again, you've got to make sure this little sun icon is ticked off. If I turn that off, That'll squash the two layers together and it won't look as good. Turn that on, it preserves the 3D editability, and it means the three-dimensional effects that you've applied in the pre-comp stay into the main composition. The other thing you might notice is obviously that we want the 19 and the 20 to disappear once they've scrolled up. So I'll jump back into the main comp and I'll show you how I've done that. And the way I've done that is just I've used a really simple mask. So let me just delete this mask and I'll show you how I'd create it. Again, so you're going to go up here to the pen tool, and then you're just going to draw a box around the thing that you want. And that should chop out the 19. Yeah, that's done a good job. Let's just solo this layer. You can solo a layer by pressing this dot just over here next to the visibility tab. So we can see just this layer. We don't want to look at too much other stuff. Let's play this through. So this is our graphic. Now, kind of like with the floating scrolling timeline, it doesn't look very good when we've got a hard edge, and we want to make the number that disappears blur out. So the way we're going to do that is we're just going to go into the mask and we'll add maybe 50 pixels of feather. There we go. And now we should end up with something that kind of slowly blends out as it rotates. Cool. So there we go. So now we've got a nice little scrolling animation. So let's just jump into the month style and I'll show you how that was made too. So it's kind of the same sort of thing. I literally just written out all of the different months. Again, there's the two layers of text. So you've got the outline at the front there and then the background behind. And then what I've done is I've just animated it by hitting position and animating the position. So obviously with this, we only want one of them in the center to be visible. So I could do that by drawing a mask like this, highlight January. But then when we keyframe it and when we move it along, it's only going to be January that is visible the whole time, and we'd have to then animate our mask as well. So what I do instead is I'm going to use another alpha matte. So you create this shape layer here, which is just a box, and again it's got a blur around the edge, and then you're going to set the months layer here to use the layer above it, this shape layer, as an alpha matte. So select alpha matte like that, and what it does is it basically just chops out everything that's underneath this shape, which is perfect for this effect because that means that the month that we want to look at is always just going to sit in the center here. And that's how we did that. And then the months and the date, they're just sort of positioned up here in three-dimensional space. I think, again, using this sort of 2.5D style, I've got them a little bit closer to the camera. And I do that, just by moving this Z-axis and sort of pulling them up like this. And I've linked the two things together by using the parent and link function again, so that any movement I make to the 2020 to the date here will also affect the months as well. And I like to position things, at different layers in three-dimensional space because I just think it makes it look more interesting. So I'm also just going to talk a little bit about how I've kind of tracked these graphics into the scene because I've used a different technique. So in the Aggie shot, what we did is we attached it to an object in the scene, which in that case was the laptop. Here, we could have done the same thing and we could have tracked it to the phone. So it's just a really bumpy handheld shot. And I tried attaching it to the phone, it just didn't look that good. So what I did instead is I actually did a proper three-dimensional camera track on this shot. So I went in here and I did the camera track, which you find down in the bottom right here. And then let me turn on the camera tracker so you can see. So the tracker does its thing and it creates all these different points and then you can create solids and shapes and stuff here. So select some of these points, go right click, create solid. It's not really where I want it to be, but it doesn't really matter. Let's rotate that around a bit. So I use that technique to create this solid here, which I'm calling track solid 1. So I'll turn that on and you can see this track solid is basically the position of where I wanted to put my graphics. And because it's three-dimensionally tracked into the scene, it's a lot neater and a lot smoother than it would be if it was attached to the phone because the phone moves around quite a lot. Whereas this plane will always hover in exactly the right place. And then I just use the parent and link function again to attach my graphics and all of my stuff to this one track solid. So you can see here the Jacob feed comp is attached to this track solid. This shape layer is attached to this track solid. Everything is either attached to this track solid or attached to something else that is then attached to this track solid. And that basically means if I want to move around all of my graphics, I just have to move this track solid and it's going to take everything with it. Or if I rotate it, it's going to rotate everything with it. And that's just the way that I set up these kind of scenes. I use one of these track solids as my base and I attach everything to that track solid. So at the beginning of this shot, we had this transition where the video sort of spins into the feed like that. So what I've done to do that is I've just animated the position in three-dimensional space. So it ends up, here, and then I've got the Z axis, the Z position. I've got it moving much, much, much closer to the camera. So you can see it's all the way up front here. So I've got it so it just zooms back into the timeline. And then I've added a bit of rotation as well. So if I hit R, you can see it goes on the Y axis, it goes from there to a full rotation on the y-axis, so it does a full 360 as it spins round. And then, select the keyframes and hit function F9, and then you get nice, easy, smooth keyframes as it moves. Another thing, as usual, when you've got anything that's moving, it's important to have motion blur clicked on, which is this little thing here. And then this button here will enable motion blur for all of the layers that have the switch set on. So I'll turn that on, and then if we just play that through, you can see that the movement of that is a lot neater. And it looks much more natural because it's a little bit blurred. And then finally, very much like the Aggie comp that we've already seen already, the other effect that I used was this one called Trap Code Shine. So I'll just turn Shine on, and it creates these kind of light beams. The thing is, though, Shine will also affect the background layer, which we don't want. So I'm going to turn that off. So here's the finished thing. Again, you can see these light beams coming through. And again, you can see the lens distortion is really helping to make this thing feel much more natural and feel like it's really a part of the scene. So that's it for this shot. I think we're going to go and check out some 360 stuff next. So this is one of the 360 sequences in the edit. There's a couple of them in there. I love using 360 cameras. I do it all the time. And one of the coolest things about 360 shots is that you can basically make these transitions work from one shot to the next, regardless of what the shot is or where it is, because it always just seems to come out looking neat. And I think one of the reasons for this is because you have this kind of consistent horizon. So on any 360 shot, you've got the separation between the ground and the sky. And when we sort of spin round to the next shot, that horizon line is pretty much the same. And you always get this kind of consistency between the shots. So the transitions just work really, really well. So I've actually done a tutorial on how I edit 360 footage, and I've gone into loads of depth. So I'm going to put a link to that here, and you can click that if you want to find out more. So I'm just going to do a really, really quick overview of how I edit 360, because if you want to go into more depth, then you should definitely watch my existing tutorial about that. So basically the starting point is obviously the 360 footage itself. These are the clips that I've selected, and I've actually rendered them out and exported them as like unfolded flat clips. There I am, look at me, looking pretty cool there, jumping in, oh yeah. So I've exported these out as like flat clips, unfolded, and then drop them into After Effects. I make a new composition, which is the size of my final frame. So in this case, it's Instagram, so it's 4x5. So let's just drop in another 360 shot so you can see. So this is jump one. This is the one that we've just seen. So I'm going to drop it into this composition at the top here. And it's totally the wrong shape for the composition. So if you right click and go transform, fit to comp, that's what we need to do for this to work. So let me just delete that for now. And then the way that the 360 magic happens is using an adjustment layer, and we apply the adjustment layer over the top of all of the clips. And we're going to throw on the effect called GoPro VR Reframe. And I think they've actually brought out another one now, which is called GoPro FX Reframe. I'm just using an old version because this is what I'm used to. But it's pretty much the same thing. And within that, if I hit U to show all the different keyframes, what I do is I basically keyframe the field of view, which is how far we're zoomed in, how far we're zoomed out, keyframe the yaw, keyframe the pitch, and keyframe the roll to sort of find the views that I want. And this is a pretty laborious process. It's kind of tedious and it takes a while. You're just adding in these keyframes at all the different positions, and then as we come to here, it sort of spins around and we get to this position, and then we go around, blah, 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 and we end up at this position here. And that's where the transition occurs as we're moving from one sort of position to another position. What I would suggest for doing this is that you don't have too many keyframes. So you pick the view that you want. So I said, well, we're going to start here. We're looking at these guys, and then we're going to end up here in this position. And then the next shot, we're going to end up here looking this way. And you'll end up with a nice smooth transition if you just sort of smooth out the keyframes. You can jump into the graph editor like this. And you can see I've smoothed out all of these keyframes by moving the handles, just so it really comes to a stop in each one of these different positions. If we look at the yaw, the thing that makes this tricky is you've got 3 different axes to worry about at all times, and you might make one adjustment on the pitch axis, which then makes the yaw look rubbish. And there isn't really any solution to that. You just have to try lots and lots of different things. You have to just tweak your position, you have to tweak your field of view, you have to tweak everything and just try and get a nice seamless flow that looks good. I'd say this 10-second sequence probably took me 4 or 5 hours to make, and I'm pretty good at this because I've done a lot of it. So yeah, it's tricky. That's all I can say. It's tricky, but the results are really cool, and you can create really cool sequences like this. There is one little bit of knowledge that I can share with you, which I think will make your life a lot easier. So yeah, we've got a nice transition here with all the keyframes going in the right direction and everything looks neat. But he kind of ends up off the edge of the frame there, and that doesn't look very cool. So what we can do, so if I turn off the adjustment layer just to show you something. So this is the shot. And obviously because it's a 360 shot, this left-hand edge here matches up with this right-hand edge here. So another trick that I've got up our sleeve is I can move the shot over to the left or over to the right, and then I can duplicate this, this other edge, and I can put it here. And that means we can also kind of reframe where we're looking in the shot. And the way that we do that is we use an effect called CC Reptile, which I've got up here. Let me delete that and I'll show you how I do that. So effects and presets, CC Rep, drop that onto the clip. And then we want to expand right, which is this side here. So expand right, drag that up. I've got the clip flipped around the other way just so the transition works better. So expand left, and then we want the setting on repeat, and it's basically just going to take this left-hand edge and put it here. And the cool thing about that now is that if I want to change where we're looking in the clip, I don't have to go into my nice keyframes that I've created here with my smooth transitions. I can actually just move the clip around by adjusting the position like this. If we go too far, we'll get to the edge where we haven't got anything, but I can fix that by adding a bit more on the right-hand side there. So this is quite a handy little trick because obviously the clip itself is now fixed in the orientation that it's looking. I can't do anything to change where I'm looking. And the way that we would normally do it is by adjusting the keyframes in our, in our GoPro VR reframe plugin here. We don't want to do that because our keyframes are very specific and they're going to mess up our transitions, and we don't want to do that. So this Reptile way is a really neat little way of adjusting where we're looking and just sort of fine tuning the clip itself once you've got your transitions nailed. So what I did once I built all these transitions is I then applied an effect called Real Smart Motion Blur, and you can see this is looking quite blurry. And that's being caused by the Real Smart Motion Blur plugin up here. This is a paid plugin. I don't think it's super expensive. It's really useful for creating transitions like this. If I turn it off, you can see that the transitions there's no motion blur, and it doesn't feel as natural. It doesn't feel like the camera is actually whipping around in a circle. But if I turn it on again, you can see it just adds this kind of extra layer of blur, and it makes the transitions feel much more natural. So I always apply a bit of motion blur to these kind of graphics sequences. So that's it for this 360 shot. There's a couple of other 360 shots in this edit, and they're very much the same. I've just used this sort of same kind of flow where I drop all the clips into After Effects and I apply the GoPro VR reframe plugin on top. That's how I create these 360 sequences.
We earned our escape, an ocean wide. Only one thing to decide.
So the next shot we're going to talk about is this 360 transition that we created. And this is actually kind of the same thing that I've talked about already. So you've got your 360 footage put into a composition, and then you've got your adjustment layer with the GoPro VR reframe plugin. So this is, each one of these keyframe points is selecting the view that we want to look at. And then we transition over to the next view. But the thing that made this tricky was obviously the shot itself is not one 360 shot. If it was just one single shot, it would be really easy. It's just a few different keyframes. But what I had to do is I had to combine together the two halves of the 360 sphere to create this shot. So I'll show you how I did that. This is the shot with the two halves of the 360 sphere combined. There's plenty of graphics layers in this as well. So I'll talk to you about the graphics in a bit, but let me just turn them off for now. So this is one half of the shot. And then this is the other half of the shot. And I basically just had to kind of mask out the 180-degree transition line just to combine the two shots together. And I did that just using a shape layer here. And initially I did, quite a lot of research. I was trying to work out what the shape should be. I was Googling all sorts of forums. And ultimately, none of that worked. It didn't end up looking like a perfect 180-degree slice. So the way that I did it was just through trial and error. So I'll turn on this adjustment layer. This has the kind of 360 stitching on it. So I'll just zoom out and I'll kind of show you how I did this. So basically I got it pretty good. I ended up with this like kind of perfect 180-degree cut. And it turned out that this shape was the shape that was required to do that. And I can't answer why. It just, for whatever reason it is. There's probably people out there who know more about 360 and who understand why this works. But I just literally, used the pen tool and I just kind of drew the shape and I just adjusted these keyframes to get to the right point. So if I start moving that around, you can see it really screws up the image. And obviously because you've got this kind of funny spherical rectangular projection thing going on, the shape that you draw here doesn't really correlate at all to the shape that you expect it to be. I think from having seen 360 footage, we kind of know that this is the sort of shape that it should probably be. So I was able just to play around with this mask, and that's how I was able to combine the two halves of the 360 sphere together. And then once you've done that, you'll end up, with effectively just one 360 clip. Although it is made up of two different 360 shots, it will stitch together because this half of the image and this half of the image will stitch together with each other. And you should have this nice kind of 180-degree transition down the center, which I did somehow manage to achieve eventually. And then the other part of this shot is all of these graphics here, and they just kind of pop up at the right time. Conveniently, there's a plugin inside of After Effects which translates your graphics from being flat and puts them into a kind of spherical field, and it's called VR plane to sphere. So these graphics, if I turn off the VR plane to sphere function, you can see it's just sort of sitting in the center here. But you turn that on again, and then you can play around with these controls here, and you can basically move it around in the kind of spherical world. And After Effects does all of the magic to enable it to work properly. Anyway, so when we jump back into the main comp, you can see we've got our two 360 shots. We've got our keyframes to move us around coming from the GoPro VR plugin. We've got our graphics messages that pop up. So when we come to the actual transition itself, the next shot was one that we actually got by putting the 360 camera on the end of a pole. I think there's a little behind the scenes video of that. And I had to just, match up the two shots so that Aggie was in the same sort of place. It wasn't perfect. I think if we'd done this again, I would have tried to place them in a slightly different place, had them maybe closer together, because when they're on the floating piece of watermelon, they are quite close together, whereas in this sort of room environment, they're a little bit further apart. But I think the idea works pretty well, and you kind of understand the transition thing that we were going for. There's also this chromatic displacement layer. That's what this adjustment layer is doing. So this is sort of giving this kind of ripple chromatic effect when she hits enter. So I used the radio waves effect to create this kind of circular force field coming out. And then on the adjustment layer, I used a plugin called Chromatic Displacement. And that turns the radio waves into this kind of cool, glassy, wobbly thing that you can see here. It's a really cool plugin. You can have it, you can have it like that. You can have it like that. You can do loads of different things with it. You can really turn up the displacement loads and loads and loads. So you can see that we create this kind of cool shimmering radio force field thing that comes out of the laptop and just helps to make the transition feel a little bit more epic. I love this plugin. So it's called Chromatic Displacement. It's made by Red Giant and it's part of the VFX suite. I have talked a lot about this plugin in my Bugsy Malone tutorial video, so I would recommend that you have a look at that if you're interested in finding out a little bit more about this plugin. Or you can watch some of the Red Giant tutorials because they've done a load of them as well. So yeah, if you're serious about this kind of stuff, I would definitely suggest checking out the VFX suite by Red Giant. There's loads of really, really cool plugins like this that can just make these nice little effects that would be very, very difficult otherwise.
Dive in, get wet. Dive in, get wet.
So the final thing we're going to talk about is this Flickbook sequence of the dive, and then there's another one of the DJ a little bit later as well. It's quite a fun little effect. I think this is quite an easy one for people to have a go at. So I'm going to go in quite a lot of detail and show you exactly how I made this. So the first thing we need to do is we need to get our image sequence sorted. So this is the original image sequence. And it's actually just a series of JPEGs that were shot by our wonderful underwater camera guy, Fraser Janes. Check him out on Instagram, absolute legend. So I just imported these images as an image sequence into After Effects. And then the kind of tedious thing about this was putting each one of these in a different frame. So you can see here, this image sequence is used in all of these different compositions, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So I'll just jump into number 1. So I found this pack of film templates and borders on Envato Elements. There's plenty of these sort of things on the internet. I'm pretty sure you wouldn't struggle to find similar things. So I just downloaded a bunch of them. So what I did is I put this image sequence inside all of these different frames, and then I froze the sequence by right-clicking, going time, and then freeze frame, and then freezing the sequence at a different point each time. So if I go back into the main comp, you can see all of these different images that we've got, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. All of them are frozen at a different point. And then to make them a little bit more interesting, I added a bit of rotation on some of them. So this is the film frame, and then this is the image sequence itself. If I just delete this mask, you can see the image itself I haven't rotated, but I have rotated the frame. So I put the frame on top of it like that. And that just means when we come into the composition and we come to layering them all on top of each other, the images themselves underneath will always line up, but the frame is at kind of wonky angle, and it just makes it seem a little bit more kind of organic and natural and a bit more surprising. And I think it gives the kind of thing a bit more charm and a bit more character to have the images offset at different angles like this. But crucially, the only thing that I twisted was the frame itself. It wasn't the image underneath. So once you've got all of the images laid out in the different compositions inside each one of these different frames, I'll show you how I created the animation as well. At the very back, we've got this kind of wooden background texture, so it just makes it feel like it's sort of on a nice wooden table. I quite like that. So I created a 3D camera and I moved around the position and the point of interest so it just moved backwards like this. So let me show you two views, because it's sometimes quite tricky to see how an After Effects camera is working. And the thing that I've done here is basically I've keyframed the point of interest to move backwards. And then I think overall, so it starts, if we're looking at the Z position here, that's the interesting thing, which is this 100 value. So that's there, this point of interest. If we come to the end of the sequence here, the Z value is on -1000. So the point of interest has moved 1000 pixels in that direction. And it's also moved a little bit off to the right. And I wanted that because I just wanted there to feel like there was some sort of consistent flow as the shape of the person diving is also moving off to the right. So we're moving backwards in three-dimensional space and we're also moving off to the right. And as you can see, as we're moving back and as we're pulling back, all of these new layers are appearing in front of the camera. So plop, 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 plop. So each image in the sequence is coming in after, I think it's after 3 frames. And then what I've done is I've positioned each one of these 100 pixels apart. So if I open up some of the position values, you can see it goes from -100 to -200 to -300 on this one. So as the camera's moving back, it's moving back 100 pixels each 3 frames. So we're on 0 here, I'll go 3 frames forward, 1, 2, 3, and the camera's now moved back -100 pixels. But a new image has dropped in, and that was 100 pixels closer to the camera. So it means that the overall separation and the overall distance between the images and the camera is the same. And that's how we create this kind of nice, consistent Flickbook sequence. And then once you've got your point of interest fixed and nailed and in the right place, then you can animate your position as well. The position just affects like kind of the orientation and the angle of the camera. So I could have come all the way back here. And the cool thing about it is if I do that, because my point of interest has been keyframed, the camera is always going to be looking at the right thing. It's just looking at a slightly more shallow angle. So I think I added a couple of keyframes onto the position there. We could have moved this one. It could have been, we could go crazy and we could come all the way up. So we could create a kind of mad transition where we go all the way up like that with loads of like a really dynamic camera move. And the cool thing about it is that it will always work and the point of interest is making this Flickbook sequence work. So the other thing that I will always do with a camera is I will enable depth of field. So if you go into camera options here, depth of field on, and that's just going to make it like a natural camera. It's going to add blur to the foreground and the background and focus in on the thing that we want. Now what you can do with this camera is if you go layer, camera, and then link focus distance to point of interest, it's going to make sure that the thing that we've chosen to look at, which is the point of interest here, is always going to be in focus. So it doesn't matter if I move the camera around, it's always going to be focusing in on the thing that we want. So definitely do that. Crank up your aperture. I've got 2000 pixels here, so it's a really nice heavy blur. I could turn that right down. If I turn that down to 200, the image is going to look a lot sharper. So everything in the foreground is going to look a little bit sharper. But I liked it nice and blurry. And the final thing I've done is on this top adjustment layer here. Let's just jump back into one view so you can see what we're looking at. I've got this effect called optical glow on. And that's just making the highlights kind of glow a little bit. And this is part of the Red Giant VFX suite that I've already talked about. And it just helps to make your graphics just look that little bit more organic and a little bit more natural. It's making the whites here really kind of pop and glow. If I turn it off, you can see everything looks a bit more dull and muted, but turn it on again, it makes the whites kind of glow. And again, it mimics what life is really like, because a white surface will always kind of reflect and glow just a little bit, even if it's only a small amount. So that's why I tend to use plugins like this to really make my graphics feel real. If you don't do this, it's hard to say why it doesn't look very real, but it's just the little things like these kind of glow effects that really help. Then I've also put on an optics compensation effect, and that just kind of stretches the corners of the image. Again, it was because I wanted to try and replicate the distortion that you get in a camera lens. It's probably the sort of thing that no one would ever notice, but I do it because I think it makes things look a little bit more real and a bit more natural. So that's the end of this Flickbook sequence. I know I've rushed through this pretty quickly, but if there's anything you want to know more about and you think I haven't explained very well, then please do leave me a note in the comments, and I maybe will do a full-on tutorial on just one of these specific elements and go into way more detail. If not, hit like, hit subscribe, and stay tuned for the next video coming soon.